We all remember every year the guns going silent, the fallen comrades in countless conflicts, and while we grieve with those whose sons and daughters do not come home, we care and protect those that do. The National Railway Museum pays special homage to those caregivers and have restored a hospital carriage from World War I. The carriage shows a typical ward, pharmacy and crew quarters, and the decor is what you would expect on a train at the time. As you wander inside, the interior is very clean and appears sterile and modern. The truth, however, was much different. The first hospital train was not meant to be a hospital train at all. In fact, it was designed to be an armed utility train to transport goods to the front line in the Crimean War. Following a public outcry regarding sanitary conditions and provisions for the wounded, a railway was built to the front line. On the 2nd of April 1855, the first train designated to carry wounded soldiers from the front line set off and arrived at the dock of Baklava to ferry them home. When the siege ended and the movement of armaments was less important, the trains began to cater for the comfort of the troops. This included the replacement of clothing, food, tents, medical supplies and books, but taking home the wounded continued. Following the success of the initial trains to get the wounded home, the government kept the idea of a dedicated train on the back burner in case it was needed again. At the turn of the 20th century, it was apparent that the world was going to go to a great war. The UK government anticipated this, and in the years leading up to the onset of World War I, they had begun to secretly prepare. The UK government knew that there were going to be many casualties in this war, so they gathered engineers, managers and leaders of the railways together and asked them to design specific carriages with provisions for treating wounded soldiers as they came home. They wanted to fit all modern medical facilities that you would find in a hospital in the confines of a train. This included pharmacies and operating theatres, and were designed to hold 500 wounded, 47 orderlies, 3 medical officers, 3 chefs and 3 nurses. They also had to provision for those doctors and nurses and crew who would be on board these trains for days, weeks, months or even years at a time. The railway companies unanimously agreed to help with the prospective war effort, and secret plans were sent to them and distributed among the carriage works so they could be ready to begin work if war was ever announced. On the 4th of August 1914, the first gun sounded as war was officially declared. Everybody had been waiting for this moment. The railway companies called upon every man available to start creating the carriages and fittings required. The first train was completed in an astonishing 20 days after the announcement of war. Bear in mind that these trains were 1/3 of a mile long, so this was astounding work from everybody involved. In fact, the railway companies were so proud of their achievements, they actually showed off the carriages across stations in the UK before they entered service. It wasn't all plain sailing for the railway industry. Conscription proved a massive problem, as many men wanted to go and help directly on the front. Because the railways were so important, anybody who worked directly with the railway were barred from signing up. The railway had also ferried guns, shells and vehicles to the many ports, and the boats would take them to the front. This was in addition to the ambulance trains that waited for the men at the docks so they could be ferried to hospitals up and down the country. The British also had to help out the French, as their railway infrastructure simply couldn't cope with the amount of injured soldiers coming back from the front. Because the railways were different at the time, the British companies were ordered to build continental ambulance trains as well as their own. By 1918, there were 20 ambulance trains used in Britain and 31 overseas. So, what would it have been like living on a train like this? What would it have been like for a soldier travelling home in a ward carriage? Unfortunately, there's no one alive today that can tell us what it was like firsthand. However, they have their diaries, and it's from their diaries and memoirs that we can get a glimpse of what it would have been like on board. Owen Willis was an orderly sergeant on such a train. He started his work at the beginning of the war in 1914 on train number 18 when he was just 18 years old, and he lived and worked aboard right through the duration of the war. He kept diaries and took photos of his experiences, some of which you can still see in the museum today. We know that from his diaries that working aboard the carriages was a cramped affair. Willis took particular measure in cleanliness and stopping the threat of diseases travelling through the train. The men that were loaded aboard, as well as being injured, would have also been lice-ridden and filthy from the trenches. He was very proud that not one single man was lost on board number 18 train. When the train arrived to carry the injured men, they were triaged before they were entered. This was to ensure that any man that had little to no hope of survival were not loaded on board. Some may think this was cruel. However, with so many injured patients, priority had to be given to those who stood a chance of survival. Once aboard, the men were transferred to a bed. These were bunk beds, and on the top bed could be folded away, giving the nurses more room for treatment. Each bed had its own ashtray and calling facilities for the nurses. The nurses, doctors and orderlies would then traverse down these wards, offering help, medical treatment and pain relief, while they were transported to either a European hospital or to the waiting medical strip to take them back to Britain. It was very dangerous work as the train was under constant fear of being bombed and attacked. Nowadays, it is considered a war crime to impersonate or destroy any target that is designated as medicinal or first aid. At first, crowds gathered on the platforms to meet the wounded soldiers home in a blaze of glory and fanfare. But when they heard of the horrors of the trenches, this soon died away, as it became apparent that many husbands and sons would not be coming home. For some men, being injured became a release in order to escape the atrocities. As the number of injured grew and grew, stations became overwhelmed, and soon the local public was helping in any way that they can, taking in soldiers and offering food and provisions. The hospital train was used right through the First and Second World Wars and is accredited to saving tens of thousands of lives. The hospital train, in general, was used right up to the end of the Cold War. Thankfully, we've never seen any mass conflicts that would ever require the use of hospital trains in that respect again. But the French have reinstated a few hospital trains in order to transport people during the current pandemic, as it's a very economical way to move a lot of people in very quick and sterile conditions. The carriage that is currently in the museum was lovingly restored back to its wartime state and shows a typical ward, pharmacy and crew quarters. You can enter the carriage and listen to the stories from the view of the nurses, orderlies and soldiers aboard, as well as viewing some of the photos Willis took and snippets from his diary. You can also hear from Nurse Kate Luard, who survived the Boer War and learned other languages in order to help her patients, and Edmund Cooper, who was morally against the war but contributed in his own way by helping the injured. The carriage and its surrounding displays can be viewed any time and is a perfect tribute to those who were at the forefront and to those who helped bring the boys home. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.